Brought to you by Sonda, Active Care Matters is a series where we bring you opinions, guidance and advice on wellbeing and safety in the workplace. Active Care is all about people being in control of their own wellbeing, their own safety and their own health outcomes, able to actively seek support on their terms, on their schedule and on their device. For organisations, it means proactively enabling and empowering people to get the care they need, where and how they need it, so they are more engaged and productive at work. Hello and welcome to Active Care Matters. I'm Craig Cowdrey, co-founder and CEO at Sonda. Today we're delighted to be joined by Brian Long, who'll be sharing his views on the most important drivers in creating a high-performing culture in the workplace. We'll be discussing how health and wellbeing policies are being redesigned to meet an ever-changing set of employee needs, how our evolving work environment needs to consider health, safety and wellbeing more than ever before, and how this all relates to the bottom line and how we actually measure wellbeing impacts. So let me start with a bit of an introduction for you, Brian. Brian is a highly influential health, safety and risk wellbeing leader who I've had the pleasure to know for nearly 3 years now. He's had an amazing career, which has taken him all over the world, including 18 years in various roles across Europe and Asia Pac at Lendlease, followed by a couple of years in Spain, actually, at the engineering consulting firm ACOM. He then moved to Australia, where he led health and safety at Woolworths Group. Currently, Brian is Group General Manager for Health, Safety and Environment at Mirvac. Brian, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Now, to kick us off, I mentioned that you worked at Woolworths leading health, safety and wellbeing. Now, Woolworths has over 200,000 staff. You joined just before COVID. So I'll be interested to take you back in time, if it's not too traumatic, to talk about your experience in leading such a critical function at Woolworths. But I actually might start with how you cared for yourself during that period. Now, we know it was an incredibly stressful time for a lot of people, particularly Woolworths as it was feeding the country, supply chain disruptions, staffing issues in their own health and safety around COVID, but also dealing with customer aggression and the like. You had a lot of that on your shoulders, but how did you take care of yourself during that period?
Yeah, firstly, very pleased to be here, and it isn't too traumatic to go back. I actually have very fond memories of that time. Mm-hmm. I think the first thing I would say around that is fundamentally, I was very keen to always distinguish between work and home and work and family. And that was quite a difficult thing to do for all of us because we were working, most of us from home for large periods during the course of the pandemic. But I would introduce a couple of rituals into my day whereby I would ensure that I would, quote unquote, get dressed up for work. And then I would go to the place where I would be sitting in front of a computer, taking calls, and ultimately being both in body and in mind engaged with the work that I was doing, much like I would have been doing if I had actually been in the office. But I would then make a deliberate point of, when the day was over, of getting out of those sort of work attire, out of that work attire, making a disconnect between the place that I was operating from, and then sort of shifting my brain into family and, being totally present and totally engaged with my family. So I guess a physical kind of manifestation of a cutoff point, and then being very comfortable with the fact that, I was surrounded by my family. And the second thing I'd say, which is, again, why I have some fond memories of the Woolworths experience, as you said in your very kind introduction, I've probably spent the best part of 20 years traveling extensively around the world. So for me, actually, the opportunity to be physically present with my family for almost 2 years, wake up in the same bed, sort of go to the same bed every night and wake up in the same bed every morning, was a massive novelty for me. And to be able to sort of, have that very sort of close to me, I actually looked at that in a very positive way. So I guess from craziness and commotion and just a very, very hectic time, I found sort of that positivity from the fact that it gave me the opportunity to spend some precious time with my family. So I guess those two things made it a doable and workable experience.
Amazing. And now coming out of COVID, how have you taken that mindset and those rituals forward into this new world, which I want to talk to you quite a bit about in terms of policies and approaches of different organisations around safety, health and wellbeing. But for yourself, have you taken some of those forward with you? Have you thought that some maybe aren't as relevant and maybe won't work going forward? Be interested to know.
Yeah, look, I think at their core, the essence or the intent of those things work, irrespective of the situation or the context that you're operating within. And I certainly, I think, have a different perspective of the important role that family can play in grounding you, in making you see that, yes, work is very important and we're all very focused on, being responsible and being present at work. But I guess if I'm a little bit critical of myself, I wonder, was I that present, with my family prior to COVID? So certainly that has served me as a great wake-up call and something that I actively do now going forward. And I'm able to make that delineation where at all possible between I'm at work and I'm now with my family. And I don't feel as if I'm letting either side down when I'm sort of in my moment or I'm present for work or I'm present with my family. I actually feel it's quite a natural thing for me to try and nurture and make happen. So that's probably the one thing that I've really held on to.
Yeah.
And I'd be, quite sort of keen to communicate that to many people, because I do think you have to make that delineation. It's pretty important.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of what you might be able to convey to other people who are listening to this or watching this around how they can approach a situation at least similar to what you experienced as an executive at a large organisation that is facing the challenge of the type of COVID, but even, and we hope we don't go through a challenge like that again anytime soon, but if you had to name top 2 or 3 tips that you would give for people to keep in mind in how they approach it from a leadership perspective, from an executive sort of perspective, from a strategy perspective, it'd be great to get that insight as well.
Sure. I mean, I think the first thing that comes to mind is most definitely, as a leader, there is a certain obligation on you to be the sort of visible face for some of the things that we'll talk about today. And that can be kind of interpreted 2 ways. Some people can feel the weight or the burden of that, or other people can see that, yes, it's an expectation and I have to lean into that. But I guess the trick for me is that they understand how important self-care is in being able to lead and being able to be the leader that people need them to be. So I guess point number 1 I would make is particularly for executives or people that are, in sort of important managerial positions, you have to focus on self-care. You have to find your techniques, you have to find your way, your kind of, I guess, equivalent to what I did. It might be yoga, it might be exercise, it might be doing things that make you feel good, but you have to find a way to prioritize your own self-care. And I think once you start to build that into your routine, it becomes somewhat second nature. Then you're better equipped to be able to say, okay, now how am I going to be, or how am I going to lead for my people? And that kind of leads to the second thing I would say. And I think the most important thing in that context when you are engaging with people is empathy. And being as empathetic and understanding of the needs of others, notwithstanding, you have to deal with so many different people with so many different needs. But one thing I've found, and certainly in engaging with leaders who've inspired me, is they always made you feel very important. And no matter how trivial or trite the issue that you might be bringing to them, you just felt like they cared and they were listening intently to what your needs might be. So I guess point number 2 I would make in addition to self-care is you've got to be willing to actively listen, to inquire, and to ultimately demonstrate that level of empathy towards the people that you work with. And then I think the last thing is you're not going to always get this right. We're dealing with human beings. We're dealing with, uber complex scenarios. There's a socio-technical component to this where you've got technical issues butting up against human issues. And so don't be overly critical or don't be overly perfectionist in the way that you go about trying to do this. Always bring it back to that essence of, well, why am I engaging with my people and what am I trying to do here? And I'd argue that ultimately what most forward-thinking companies today or good leaders today are trying to do is they're trying to care for their people in a responsible and appropriate manner. And if I think you can keep those 3 things front of mind, then you'll be on the right sort of path to doing some of the things we're talking about today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I recall from my own experience, and we have a lot of people at Sonder with military backgrounds, that one of the early things that you learn is that you need to be able to care for yourself. And it's similar to first aid, right? It's hard to help anyone else if you've not taken care of yourself first, but it's also really important to set an example to everyone else that not only is it okay, it's actually what they should be doing in making sure that they're really exercising that self-care.
Yep.
And now in today's society, certainly over the last 10 years, there's a real change in a recognition of well-being and whether it comes to fitness, mental health, nutrition, and so on, a real explosion, a positive explosion of interest in this space. How do you think that that's really changed employee expectations around working with their employer to be the best version of themselves, to be really happy and healthy?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some fascinating things happening in the world of work at the moment. You've got different generations all working together with probably different expectations around some of the things that you've just referred to. But at a very basic level, particularly the younger generations, I don't think it's a request anymore. I think it's a demand.
Yeah.
So people are coming to work and expecting that, it's not going to be a badge of honor to work 22 hours and it's going to be flogged into submission anymore. It's actually, you respect me as a human being. You give me the tools and the capacities to do my work properly. I commit to delivering upon those, but I also commit to living my life and having, some opportunity to enjoy my life outside of work. And that's becoming more and more apparent as you engage, particularly, as I say, with younger generations.
So in your world, Brian, how have you seen that affect policies that organisations are developing and implementing to really meet that, what is really a demand from employees as part of their experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think Mirvac has become quite renowned for embracing a couple of things. One is the diversity angle. We absolutely embrace people's individuality, and that's on so many different levels. And you can see that in the types of people that come to work at Mirvac and just the way that the culture and the environment absolutely encourages people to, be their real self, to be able to say what they really think. That psychological safety component that, I think we do relatively well in most of our settings. The other thing that we've worked very hard on is flexibility. And again, I think the flexible working policy that has been introduced pre-COVID, I may add, in the context of Mirvac, is certainly setting us apart. And I know, the feedback from so many people is, this is an amazing place to work because, yes, you expect me to do ABC, but you cater for both my individuality, but also just my needs in terms of a person with family or with other things that I may need to kind of bring to the equation. So they're probably two of the big call-outs. I would say in our industry, it's quite interesting as well to highlight, particularly in the baby boomer space. I think it was kind of pretty normal to, be uber resilient to the point of probably almost killing yourself in terms of the hours worked or the amount of travel between different sites or the bad diet or just the I'm tough because I can lift, heavy weights or whatever the case may
Really a
be.
badge of honor.
Absolutely.
It was worn in that way. Yeah.
And no, to see that kind of being challenged is quite interesting. And in a way, it was the same at Woolworths. And I do think this is probably the missing bit still in most industries, and that is we've got to move beyond people caveating, we're very committed to your well-being or we're very committed to allowing you to be your real self, but it's tough in construction or, retail's pretty tough because we have to work all these hours or we have to, there's always that caveat or that but. And I think the real unlock for the next sort of 5 to 10 years will be, actually, no, there's no buts here. This is, we can do our work and we can respect people and enable them to be at their best. And we've got to find a way to make work different, not make people different. And that's the kind of interesting equation and dynamic that's starting to be played out. And I think the companies that figure that out, employers of choice, they'll kick on. Companies
those are the stakes, right? I mean,
correct. That's exactly right. I think we're in that world of those that will find that and find a way, they'll be the successful organizations.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point you make and one that we talk about a bit here at Sonder, which is that you need to really tailor the employee experience to that employee's needs, not just because that's what they demand, but because that is also what makes them a happier and healthier and therefore more productive employee. And that's what attracts people to that environment, helps them to be their best version of themselves in that environment, and often to stay longer as well. And a big part of that is meeting them at their point of need, allowing them to take control, or we call sort of active care, over their own wellbeing journey, because everyone is different, as we've spoken about.
Absolutely. And look, I think it's a positive thing that we've seen codes of practice and regulation start to evolve in the last number of years. Obviously, the emergence of psychosocial risks and hazards, a light being shone on that's absolutely going to start to force employers to look at those work conditions, at the work environment, at work itself, and really start to sort of evaluate what is it about the work that I'm putting onto people that I could do better or different. Could I leverage technology to make it better for people? So I think all of these things are starting to move the needle towards that place where we start to sort of actively challenge the notion of work, and that work is what it is, but it's definitely not something that should be sort of, I guess, a deterrent of somebody's well-being or their overall wellness.
Well, absolutely. I mean, and ideally the two are aligned. I mean, I think there was a previous time when people thought, and perhaps some people still think this today, that high well-being is a nice to have, but it comes at the expense of performance and business performance. But actually, a really strong well-being can contribute, and does contribute strongly to business performance. But I wanted to ask you about, and to drill into that point around the employer's role in supporting their employees, this concept of shared responsibility. I think when I talk to a lot of people leaders, it's recognised, it has been for a long time, that there's a shared responsibility between the employer and the employee around the environment in which they work. Certainly the physical environment for a long time, around traditional slips and trips, OH&S. Now there's this evolution towards, really looking at psychological safety, but also psychosocial hazards in the workplace. That definition of shared responsibility and what the company is liable for, where do you see that liability start and stop? And how do you see shared responsibility really playing out in a really effective way?
Yeah, I mean, I think firstly the thing I'd say, Craig, is I get nervous around words like liability, and you didn't say this, but these two things tend to go hand in glove. Liability and blame or culpability. I think the opportunity with this kind of a conversation is to keep it at the shared responsibility piece. And the reason I say that is because actually the physical safety realm gives us some really good insights into what can be achieved, but also some of the pitfalls and some of the things that can go wrong if you over sort of focus on a particular area or a particular way of responding to this kind of challenge. Yes. And what I mean by that specifically is it wasn't that long ago that most organizations, particularly in the 90s and early 2000s, would have actively said that the physical health and safety of people is a shared responsibility. So we will give you tools, but you have to be safe because it's on you to be safe. I think what's happened over the last 20 years in particular, though, a little bit parallel to what I said earlier, is that the companies that have really been successful in eradicating the possibility of physical harm are the ones that have understood that actually the dominant player in this is the organization and the fixing of the organizational factors and the changing of the view or the notion around what people can be. And actually people are a resource to be cherished and utilized as opposed to a resource that needs to be kind of controlled or monitored or checked or be compliant. So I think there's some real strong learning opportunities with the journey that people have been on with physical safety. And when I reflect on shared value or shared accountability or shared responsibility, I always sort of put that emphasis on, of course, individuals need to be responsible and need to do the right thing and, need to act with respect and, integrity, etc. But organizationally, organizations must do a lot more, I think, in terms of the fabric of what they put in place around work and what are the expectations that they're placing on people, because it's only then that you'll get that true shared responsibility and shared accountability.
Yeah, and those inputs into really creating that environment around classic things that we hear all the time, job clarity, being linked to the company's purpose, being given the resources, knowing what success looks like, being given regular feedback. All of these types of things are so important to contribute to that outcome. I wanted to zero in, though, on the health, safety and environment team's sort of role in this. I mean, whether it's a HSE professional or a group, or that's carried perhaps in some organisations by the people and culture or HR team. What's their role really in not only implementing policies that they have control over, but also monitoring their success and actually following up to make sure there's appropriate iteration and improvement there?
Yeah, I think it's quite a wicked problem for most organizations at the moment in the context of how do you manage and administer this particular aspect amongst team. 10 years ago, it was very traditionally kind of a HR team's responsibility to manage people. I think organizations where there was a traditional exposure to maybe higher risk or the possibility of somebody being seriously hurt or killed, they tended to have a health and safety department as well. So you kind of delineated on HR would look after the more people administration and safety would look after that sort of risk component. More and more organizations have obviously evolved, and like most organizations, I would say, would have pretty robust and mature departments in those two areas. What wellbeing now is doing though is it's challenging the way these two entities within an organization actively come together to support wellbeing, because it is kind of the nexus or the crossover of those two things. There's a risk component, but then there's also a people care, coaching, mentoring, assessing, responding to need component. And those two kind of groups have traditionally operated quite separately. What wellbeing is forcing upon organizations is how do I bring these two bits together? And quite frankly, do I have the capacities within my organization to be able to do this effectively? So I think over time, the notion of well-being and how you assess the risk, but then respond to the need, you may actually start to see a whole kind of new cohort emerge, which is somewhat of an amalgam between safety risk people and more sort of, I guess, responsive care, people-focused individuals that have traditionally come up through HR. So we're no different to anybody else. We're kind of grappling with that at the moment. And I think the policy landscape is the same. People are trying to match these two policies where I know I've got to assess risk and manage the risk, but I can't get all too tick boxy and, kind of clipboardy, because at the end of the day, that will sort of drive the wrong message and the wrong behavior. So how am I going to maintain this level of care and support that people have kind of wanted to demand? So interesting area that is sort of, I guess, a work in progress for most people, I would say.
Absolutely. And how's that shift playing out in the executive sort of forums and boardrooms, and what's coming out from those bodies in terms of their level of expectation, their interest in this space, and how they're seeing it evolve over time?
Yeah, I would say there's a few things happening. I think firstly, there's a growing interest and awareness at board level in particular and executive level. It's definitely been turbocharged on the back of the pandemic, which again, to your initial question, there are some of the positive things that have come out of the pandemic. It's kind of placed it on the executive and board agenda, and probably that's never going to go away, which is good. I think there's a apprehension still around what are the questions I should be asking, or what are the things I should be interested in. And there's definitely this uncertainty around, but if the person is presenting an issue and that's a home or a lifestyle issue, what is it about work and how do we make that? And should work be responsible? And so that's certainly an area that I think people are kind of grappling with, which is why I think it's not a bad thing that things have evolved in recent times around, if we could prioritize at the very least that psychosocial component, which is the coming together of the work factors with the individual factors, then I think boards and executives can at least see that's a frame, and I can anchor to that frame, and I can ask proper questions around not just what we are doing as an organization to fix those work factors, but what is it that we can do in terms of more, I guess, triage and supporting the individuals, which is where people like Sonder come in terms of helping people, just grapple with their daily lives and indeed blending together life and work.
And when it comes to measuring the impact, the different metrics I'm sure you look at and that the board or executive would look at when it comes to, mitigating some of the hazards that might be in place, but there's a compliance angle there, and notwithstanding that, I agree in terms of the framing around liability, but there is legislation that's come out.
Sure.
But ideally getting beyond that to actual, productivity metrics, any sort of insight on how you think about measuring the impact of these different programs, and from from an individual level, but also from an organizational level, commercial level?
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think firstly, there's a foundational thing that most organizations need to get their head around, and that is how do you measure the psychological safety component that exists within an organization? Because most of the things that we've been talking about today won't flourish until such time as people feel it's safe and it's okay to raise a particular issue. So if you've got an issue with a boss, or you've got an issue with a policy, or you've got an issue with a teammate, if your work environment is one where it's not sort of the norm, or it's not encouraged for people to openly speak about those things, or people are encouraged to speak about those things, then it's unlikely those things would get sort of the treatment or the airtime they deserve. So we're starting to look at how do you quantify psychological safety, and what is it that you could measure, assess, count in the context of, is this a safer or less safer environment than it may have been prior? So I think that's sort of a foundational thing that most people need to get right. And then after that, my sense would be that we'll start to look at people's buy-in to particular initiatives or particular programs, or the amount of times that they do a particular thing, and we can correlate that with their contribution to a particular endeavor in the organization, or their contribution to the financials or some other commercial aspect, and start to see that point that you've just made, which is my employees, when they feel truly backed, truly cared for, truly respected, lo and behold, they're willing to give that discretionary effort, and I can track and measure the connection between those two things. But I would like to stress, and I reiterate, you can't do any of this without this psychological safety. And I think particularly in these organizations today, where we've got boomers and we've got Gen Zs and Gen Ys and all the other generations in between, everybody's got a different take on that stuff. The older generations, you don't see it. Don't dub in your friends, but younger generations, a whole different perspective on. So organizations really have to figure out, how do I create that psychological safety whereby that tolerance exists? And once I create that, then I think you'll start to see people embracing a lot of the things that we're talking about.
Absolutely. And actually, you've just jumped to, I've got some quick fire questions here I wanted to move to, Brian. So actually, the first one you've just touched on already. So I wanted to move through these questions, get your snap responses, and then I'll sum up a bit towards the end. You've been very generous with your time, and thank you again for that. So first, which generation do you think is best at taking active control in their lives? I'll define the generations for you. Boomers, mentioned, Gen X, Gen Y, or Gen Z?
I think they all take active control of certain things within their lives, and that's not meant to be a cop-out. But I do reflect on boomers. Tended to be good golfers, so they must have been doing something right in the context of work and recreation, because they seem to enable time to be able to play golf. But joking aside, I think you're looking at the later generations in the context of, they're very, very clear that work is a component part of a holistic kind of menu of things that they want to do in their life. And I think that's where we need to evolve to, that most people can see it that way. So I would say, yes, it's the Zs probably that are a little bit ahead of the game in terms of understanding that.
Okay, well, sticking on generations, what do you think Generation Alpha, so 2010 onwards, and I think your son is...
My son is 11, yes.
11, so he's in that category. What is he going to teach us about wellbeing when he's a bit older? Or even now, as the next generation?
So I'll use him as an example. One thing that he does really, really well is he expresses his views, and he isn't conditioned by preconceived things that people have told him or the context that he's in. If he believes that something needs to be said or he needs to convey something, he will. I've actually seen a couple of his friends and the dynamic, and they all seem to do that. So my sense is that psychological safety component, these guys are just going to sort of smash through that and make sure that, hey, if we've got an issue or we've got a problem, we are going to say that, and we are going to make sure that people take notice and respond to that. So that's a good thing, and I would say that's going to be great.
And your son's name?
Is Marcus.
So Marcus, in terms of the technology Marcus is using now, but going forward, what tech is going to help us most, or maybe be most detrimental to improving wellbeing?
Yeah, look, I think AI is the logical place for all of us to go. I can only imagine what Sonder is dreaming up in that context. But coupling what you do, which is you literally, and I think I might have coined this phrase, you can have a guardian angel in your pocket.
I think you did back in Woolworths.
Based on your technology today, it's, I can't even imagine what it would be like when you start to overlay some of the AI opportunities, ChatGPT and all these things that are emerging. It'll be fascinating, but reiterate the fact that really nothing or nobody is out of reach to anybody in the world, which has got to be a good thing, I guess, in terms of supporting somebody's well-being.
And speaking of the future, what's your favourite futurist prediction, if you have one?
I think it will be that AI isn't going to take over. It's that AI is going to make us better human beings. The watch out, I think, is the phase we're living in, which is, and I'll put my safety hat on here for a second. The Boeing 737 MAX is the perfect example. Technology and AI, amazing, but don't underestimate the need or importance of a pilot, which is ultimately what happened, I think, in and around that particular accident. So I think we're living through this kind of generation of one is coming up. People are starting to understand or trying to understand what they do with the human component. Let's just not get rid of the human beings too quickly, because we might all be in trouble.
Yeah, we want technology to enable and augment human connection and expertise, not replace it.
Absolutely.
And now, last question, and this is a question I've taken from a podcast I used to listen to, so not an original. But if you could have a billboard that every health safety environment sort of expert could see, or people leader could see every day on their way to work, what would be that one message you'd put on there?
Wow, that's a good question.
And like I said, not one of mine, so can't claim it.
I think it would be back to my point around empathy and understanding. So something along the lines of never tire of inquiring whether somebody might need something, or you could support them or help them with something that they might need, because you never know. Something like that.
And a great way to end. Thanks very much for your time, Brian.
Thanks, Craig.
And thanks to everyone who's been listening and watching, and we'll see you next time on Active Care Matters.
Thank you.
When it comes to healthcare, sometimes there's more to it, so much more than initially meets the eye. So what we do here at Sonda, rather than just treating what's on the surface, we believe in delving deeper and unpacking the identity of the cause of the presenting issue. Recently, this approach proved invaluable when a member came through who we'll call Brett, contacted Sonda because he was feeling a little bit uneasy, a little bit on edge. And the Sonda nurse used a number of techniques to encourage him to open up. You develop rapport, you listen. That's the biggest thing at Sonda. You need to listen as a nurse when you're speaking to somebody. It's about their story. It's not about yours, and it's about validation as well. So Brett revealed that he'd moved into community housing with his mum, and she was a recovering alcoholic and drug addict, and a roommate who the roommate has also been released from jail. So Brett was in a bit of a sticky situation because he was meant to sort of be coming clean, meant to be getting his head around trying to help himself and enable himself to sort of get a job and move forward and things. And he was finding it increasingly difficult because of mum and, of course, the roommate. So sort of the nurse initially confirmed his safety. And that's one thing that we do here at Sonda. It's all about safety first, and then we look into, what else we can help with. Harm to self, harm to others is sort of what we're looking at. So she guided him and tailored the conversation in order to unpack the whole situation. And during the course of the conversation, Brett revealed that he'd been struggling to look after mum, leading her to become very verbally abusive and emotionally abusive, which had turned into physical violence as well for him. So with this in mind, Brett was connected to resources that could make a difference. And in this case, temporary emergency accommodation was a priority, as well as Lifeline. And the reason we chose Lifeline, it's one of our pathways that we do use, but Lifeline is immediate assistance. The intervention sort of empowered Brett to make some difficult choices in his life, but set him on a path to enabling him to see a brighter future. And he was able to do that in conjunction with the psychologist that he'd been seeing for a few months. Don't forget to join us next time on Active Care Matters.